Good evening. My name is Donato Loya. I was recently the Vivian L. Smith Fellow at the Menil Collection, and I am a PhD candidate in art history at the University of Texas at Austin. Thank you to Da Camera for providing the wonderful music that was just playing from a live recording of the Aizuri Quartet performing Conlon Nankaro. And thank you all for joining us this evening. Before we get started, I'd like to let everyone know that you can continue to submit your questions for us by emailing programs@menil.org. This is the Menil's second In Dialogue program, and I'm very happy to be joined online tonight by James Elkins. Good evening, Professor Elkins, and thank you for being with us.
Absolutely, it's a pleasure.
Many of our viewers might already know Jim Elkins, but for those who are not familiar with his work, Professor Elkins is the E.C. Chadbourne Chair of Art History, Theory and Criticism in School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Despite the difficult circumstances we are in, Professor Elkins and I are delighted to have this opportunity to bring a work from the Menil Collection to you, thanks to this online program. Our focus this evening is on a work by Dan Flavin from 1970, entitled To Barbara Wool, which is currently installed in the Menil's Modern and Contemporary galleries, along with two other works by Flavin, entitled for Charlotte and Jim Brooks 7 and Untitled to Helen Winkler. The Menils had a great admiration for Flavin, which culminated with the commission of the permanent site-specific work in Richmond Hall on the Menil campus. For those of you in Houston, we hope to share Flavin's work with you when the museum is able to reopen. Until the mid-20th century, marble, pigments, bronze were materials still largely connected to the great tradition of art. Then Flavin's use of industrial material, here seen with the mass-produced fluorescent tube lights, seemed to exclude any correspondence with the tradition of art historical objects. However, he also thought about these objects and simple geometrical forms in relation to the history of painting and sculpture. In the case of this work, entitled To Barbara Wool, the shape is like that of a Greek cross, which is a common Christian form. Light, generally speaking, might also have obvious religious references, and yet Flavin constantly opposed overly spiritual and symbolic interpretations of his works. Professor Elkins, what do you make of this tension between religious references and the deliberate desire on the side of the artist to exclude any symbolic religious interpretations of his work?
Yeah, well, that's exactly what got me interested in this subject more years ago than I want to say right now. It's an intractable problem in the art world. It's a very interesting problem because I teach at an art school, and I became aware of the fact that if students did religious art, if they weren't represented any of the major world religions, and if they weren't also critical of those religions, then they basically couldn't get critiques. They couldn't get responses. And the same thing extends in general to the art world. So this phenomenon it's a fascinating one to me because it's a problem of conversations or discourses or communities. And it's lasted, I think, about 2 generations. I think it's at least 2 generations now because in Flavin's generation, you have, for example, Warhol with the Last Supper. This is the question of his piety is also really interesting and different from what we're talking about today. And Christo could be considered the same generation. A lot of the same issues arise with Christo. And then in more contemporary, like maybe the next generation or the present generation, you have Olafur Eliasson, the same sorts of issues with those light environments that he does, and Saigbo Chang, who has spoken about his Christian beliefs. So anyway, it's about 2 generations now. And it doesn't really extend before that. So it's not a phenomenon for all of modern art. It's a problem for everything from the 60s to the present. And sometimes it's been a generative characteristic of the art of those times. So I think of this as it's a practical problem in terms of teaching and learning. It's a community problem. It's a discourse problem, if I could use an academic way of thinking of it, because it has a lot to do with the people, how people write. I think maybe one of the ways that's useful to start a conversation about it is to ask, if you present the work as non-religious, the way most institutions do, the way that most museums and most catalogs would, if you present work like these ones I've mentioned as non-religious, then what meanings are you changing or misunderstanding by presenting the work as fundamentally secular? And just by way of opening this general issue, I think one of the answers there probably is you have, if you present and understand work like this and others as being fundamentally secular, you might be importing ideas from earlier generations of modernism that were very committedly secular for different reasons. So there might be also a longer historical problem here.
Speaking of this longer historical problem, I want to try to give also to our viewers a sense also of the contradiction to a certain extent, or the paradox within the work of Flavin himself with regards to these religious references that are to a certain extent not without to a certain extent, that they are undermined by the artist himself. For example, Flavin had attended Catholic schools. He studied for the priesthood. In the 1960s, he made several monochromatic paintings with lights attached that he entitled Icons. He also accepted commissions for religious spaces, like, for example, the Chiesa of the Santa Maria in Chiesa Rossa in Milan, one of the last works that he also one of the last commissions that he also accepted, as long as with the Richmond with the work that he made in Richmond Hall for the Menil. And very last thing, when an artist like Flavin uses a motif like a Greek cross, it is impossible that he's not aware of the symbolic power of the cruciform shape. But when we go look at these statements, we will find claims like my fluorescent tubes never burn out desiring a god, or he will say they bring a limited light. They are my icons, which he put in quotation marks. They are anonymous, inglorious. And I don't want to, of course, undermine the value of the statements of the artist, which I believe they should be considered seriously always. But I was wondering if you think that Flavin maybe is implicitly telling us the impossibility, the difficulty for him to create religious art with the means that he was using.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's also, again, characteristic of that generation. And so, since you're at the Menil and you're talking about this, you should also mention the Rothko Chapel, which is close to it in time, close to this piece in time, and also raises a lot of the exact same issues, where you have an artist who spoke about religion, was open about that, at least with his friends, and at the same time despaired of the possibility of adequately communicating that. Yeah, thanks. Sorry, yeah. I'm leaping ahead to the Rothko Chapel. Yeah, I was, when I first started this research, I visited there, and I spent a couple of days reading all of the visitors' booklets there, and that actually made a big impression on me, because I read them all the way back to the beginning when they were first kept, and the visitors almost all are open to different versions of religious or spiritual or mystical or personal experiences in ways that I think Rothko was aware couldn't possibly suffice, couldn't possibly work, especially in an art world setting, even though this was, as we know, a Stations of the Cross. Architecturally, it was originally meant to be that way. So you have an awareness on the part of this generation that they can't speak openly about these things. And I think one of the things to ponder is how much of that is the result of a falling off or a skepticism on their part about aspects of their church, in Flavin's case, Irish Catholicism and his experiences, in others, different experiences, and how much of it is a matter of an awareness of turns, potential strategies within the art market, which even at that time was not open to artists expressing major faiths.
Yes, I'm just thinking now at the very famous quote for at least people in the art world, or that are familiar with art criticism. Rosalind Krauss, in a very notable essay in 1979, she will say, "For us, in the 20th century has become indescribably embarrassing to pronounce the word art and spirit in the same sentence." Fascinatingly enough, is 1979, which
yes, sorry, can I, since you quoted that, can I quote the quotation I always think goes well with that one is something that that Tim Clark, that T.J. Clark wrote at one point as part of a much bigger argument, to be fair, to be sure. But the line is, "I will have nothing to do with that self-satisfied leftist claptrap of art as substitute religion." It's a particularly good one.
Yes. No, you mentioned at the very beginning the work that inspired you to start investigating this topic, and I want to mention it on the strange place of religion in contemporary art that you published in 2004, and there's been a germinal text to reinitiate the conversation on the relation between art and religion. I was thinking, I wanted to ask you, do you think that something has changed in the last 16 years? Do you think that today religions and spirituality are still seen in the art world and in academia as obsolete ideas? Of course, we have examples, as I mentioned, the Menil Collection, but I could have also mentioned that the Dia Foundation or the Panza Collection, that they tried to, how can I say, find the possibility of recreate a sacred art, or Panza was, for example, very much invested in the American sublime, and some artists they seem to be invested into that aesthetic and cultural project. Do you think that today there's more room, so to say, more space for a conversation on art, religion, and spirituality, or still they are considered by a large sector of the academia? When I mention academia, of course, I'm talking of the art history departments as outmoded patterns of thinking.
Well, I'm glad you said that. I didn't. So, yeah, a lot has changed in 16 years, for sure. I suppose if there's one important thing to be said, though, is that the main problem and problematic still remains. These principal forces are still in play. So it was just a couple of days ago that I was on a Zoom studio critique, because I teach at an art school, and a student, an East Asian student, was showing work which was getting a fairly good critique. And then she showed one piece which was incomprehensible to the Western panelists, her instructors, because it was what's generically called in the West a mandala, but it was a Buddhist piece. It got almost no response, and that's absolutely typical of this phenomenon. And in that respect, it hasn't changed since 2004. Part of the reason why that student didn't get any response in that context was people imagine if it's a religion they don't know much about, and it's just shown along with other artworks, that they're not supposed to ask. But so in terms of, so your question about the change, I think the major change has been in the last 5-6 years. But it hasn't been, it's been opening up. The questions of religion are more acceptable in many different contexts, but the reason is not a direct rapprochement between the secular art world, as it were, or academic world on the one hand, and artists of faith on the other. It's not that. And I think it's been mostly the surprising expansion in interest in affect theory. Because as emotions and feelings and affect become things that artists, art theorists, art critics, and historians write and talk much more about, it's hard to keep the doors closed on religious questions. And so in my experience in the last 5-6 years or so, more or less, there's been a diminution in the sort of allergic reaction that a whole generation trained in secular modernism has felt in the past. But the problematic's still very much there.
We have received a question from Joseph, Professor Elkins, that I would like to read you. How does Flavin use of powerful cross image compare with Malevich, as in his cross image in the famous photograph of the installation of 1915, the last futurist exhibition of 010?
So do we have like about 5 hours if we have? It might take a little while to get into that. I suppose, okay, as a 30-second answer to that question, Malevich was very much concerned with the values that are now called transcendental. He was interested in utopian futures. He was interested in values of the invisible, values of infinity, all kinds of things that are generically called transcendental. But with Flavin, there is this insistence on the here and now, and that's as the whole movement of minimalism used to be called, literal meanings, literal presence, immediate presence, and therefore tacitly or rhetorically a rejection of those transcendental values. That's my 30-second answer. maybe it'd be prudent not to go on too far.
I was wondering, speaking of continuing this conversation about Malevich and Flavin, I remember Octavio Paz, I believe, who said the avant-garde of the 1967 replicates the gestures of the avant-garde of the 1917, but without the same strength, without the same power. And Peter Burger in the theory of the avant-garde, 1974, he will say exactly the same thing. Of course, there is an art criticism, especially in the United States, Hal Foster, who said, no, this is not true. The avant-garde of the 1967 actually actualizes the promises of the historical avant-garde. Feminism, the feminist art, post-structuralism, and all the tendencies that happened after the 1960s, they were a materialization of the historical avant-garde and the way of continuing that conversation. Where do you stand into this debate?
I think, well, with that kind of claim, I mean, Peter Burger is another big subject, and so is Hal Foster's responses. But with that kind of claim in general, that is to say, the claim that finds a bridge between two disparate historical moments, for me, it's often a question of the desire to make the claim. Why, in any given case, does a person want to say that, in this case, Malevich is like Flavin? Whether Flavin is a decadent echo, a belated sign of a last wave of modernism, or whether it's something that makes good on the promises and flaws of the first generation of modernists, it's another question. But the desire that drives the question is often to make the bridge or to break the bridge that people think is there. So I'm not so certain that it's helpful in the end to go too far with this kind of parallel, since, just to stick with the Malevich, just to make it a little bit concrete, I think the Malevich and this Flavin that we're talking about today are a little bit like what they call in linguistics false friends. They look the same, but there's an awful lot of difference in their meanings. In fact, I suppose a place to start there would be to note the fact that Malevich had all sorts of meanings. He wrote a couple of brilliant texts, utopian texts, and Flavin, in harmony with his generation, is full of all sorts of systematic and sometimes slightly unbelievable rejections. He's not as intransigent about that kind of behavior as someone like Ad Reinhardt, but he is closing doors on meanings that he thinks that people would like to propose.
Do you ever have the impression that the art history goes on two separate paths at times? Like on one hand, we have the history of theory, and on the other hand, we have the history of practices, of art practices.
Yeah, no kidding. Do studio art people ever talk to art historians? That's yet another of these endless Zoom meetings we've all been subjected to. For me, was a meeting this afternoon with people who teach our first-year students studio practice, and I represented at this meeting part of my department of art history, people who teach art history, there is very little discourse on the connections between these two sides.
Going back to Flavin's work, I would like to read you a quote from the artist. It's 1987, so it's a few years after these works that we're looking at today. The quote is a little bit long, Professor Elkins, but I think it is interesting to hear also the artist's voice. So says Flavin, everything is clearly, openly, plainly delivered. There is no hidden psychology, no overwhelming spirituality that you are supposed to come into contact with. I like my use of light to be openly situational, in the sense that there is no invitation to meditate, to contemplate. It's in a sense a get in, get out situation, and it's very easy to understand. One might not think of light as a matter of fact, but I do. And it is, as I said, as plain and open and direct an art as you will ever find. Do you agree with this statement of the artist? Is it really true that it is very easy to understand? Is it really that plain and open and direct? I believe this is oftentimes minimalism is, or art that is so-called minimalism is reduced to this excess of simplicity, to this kind of rhetoric, but probably it is not that simple as Flavin himself is saying.
Yeah, how about we could just say definitely not as simple as he says, right? Definitely not very easy to understand, definitely not plain, not open, and not direct in practically any way. I mean, this was the claim, of course, of literalism or minimalism at the time, that it's necessary to repudiate transcendental meanings and so on. And I think one of the first things that our art students learned where I teach is we teach them to, our instructors, mistrust students who tell us what their work is. I mean, if Flavin was a student and he had read out to me what you just read of him, I would have said, oh, that's nice, but now can we talk about what's really happening in your work? So there's another quotation from Flavin that I had put down in my notes because it fits perfectly with that one. And it seemed to me like a really interesting, a kind of a pivot point for understanding a number of these different claims that Flavin makes there. And that quotation is, it is what it is, and it ain't nothing else. Everything is clearly, openly, plainly delivered. So that it is what it is and ain't nothing else. I know who he got this from. He got it from Wittgenstein. It's quoted by Wittgenstein. It's one of Wittgenstein's favorite quotations. And Wittgenstein stole it from G.E. Moore, an English philosopher beginning of the 20th century, who had it on the title page of his book, Principia Ethica. That's 1903, in case anyone wants to look it up. And G.E. Moore took it from Bishop Joseph Butler, who's an 18th century English philosopher. Everything is what it is and not another thing. So it has a long history of being stolen, and Flavin's only the last one to steal it. So it does an awful lot of work and also gets the speaker in a lot of trouble in each case, including Wittgenstein's. Because if you maintain that it is what it is and it ain't nothing else, what you're essentially saying is this work simply exists. In this case, it's neon and electric wires, and some metal. But then you've literally painted yourself into a corner, if I could use that expression with this work of art, because then you are actually forbidding not only everyone else, but also yourself to read anything into it, which is absolutely impossible. It's a different question whether or not you would prefer to say that this work should remain outside the realm of language and words, and it is a different question whether or not you'd like to say, but Mr. Flavin, you're a nice Irish Catholic kid, right? You know that's not true. So it's a different question where you go from that kind of assertion. But the assertion is a way of proclaiming, in the way that other minimalists did in different contexts, that they would like to have people not openly entertain these meanings because they want to shut down signification in that way.
We have received another question from Natalie that I would like to ask you, Professor Elkins. Natalie, she's asking, what do you make of the Menil installing the Flavin works by themselves in the first gallery? In your opinion, does installing them without other artworks nearby create a kind of spiritual or religious space?
Yeah, I wonder. I mean, since now we're talking about what I can see in the pictures and what I can remember of previous installations, doesn't that depend an awful lot on how isolated they are? I mean, the image you have up right now gives an awful lot of wall space to the one piece or to both pieces.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not so sure how to respond to that. Also, there's a whole problem, a problematic in curation in modernism and postmodernism about how much wall space art objects need in order not to have viewers be distracted. And if you look back in the history of exhibitions, if you go back as far as the 18th century and before, you had walls with paintings, frames literally touching each other, because back then, for some reason, people were not so easily distracted. They could even look at religious paintings hung in that way. But now it seems that they need more and more space. At the end of that road, you have, James Turrell installations and things which you also have there that are by themselves forever. So I'm not so sure, but maybe the question was also about different kinds of artworks. So if you showed a Greek cross next to the piece we're talking about today, if you put the Greek cross right next to it, you might actually be doing something very interesting. You might be talking back to Flavin. You might be saying, well, you claim that, but have a look at this, right? So that would not necessarily do anything to undermine these resonances, religious, spiritual resonances.
Yes. I would like to expand also our conversation about Flavin's works, also looking beyond the theme of the religious references. And already in the 1960s and throughout the 70s, we touched a little bit about it already. We noticed among many American artists self-conscious attempt on their part to absorb, so to speak, the viewer within the space of the work. The work is not something that you only look at, as you might do with a painting or a sculpture. In the case of Flavin, light has this ability to irradiate the work within the space of the viewer. It defines a space, but that must be inhabited by the viewer. Now, I don't remember where I read this quote, but this is something that happens already with some artists like, of course, Barnett Newman or Mark Rothko. I remember reading a quote saying, a painting by Rothko is not something that you look at, but you must inhabit the work. And so I wanted to ask you, why do you think it became so important for a generation of artists, at least from the 1960s, to dematerialize their works within the exhibition space?
I was all ready to answer that until you got to your last clause there, where you use the word dematerialization, because I think a lot of what you're saying there could work without that word, because those kinds of refusals that you're talking about, self-conscious attempt to absorb the viewer, that is problematic that's concerned people ever since the 60s. That question and the self-consciousness of it is crucial. So for art historians and critics like Michael Fried, that's meretricious, to use one of his words, to make a person self-aware of that attempt to absorb, right? In other words, it's unsuccessful, because if you think of things that way, when you're in front of these pieces, you may very well think about being absorbed, but you're actually not. You're actually in a gallery looking at the way that the thing was installed, and you're very much aware. It's very much about self-consciousness, and it's an awareness of this quote-unquote meretricious attempt to absorb you. So that entire thematic, I think, and critiques like Fried's and others that have followed him and argued against him can do a lot of work and can help a lot with works like this. But that word dematerialization, I don't think it's necessary in this case. I mean, you're dealing with light, but then again, oil paintings are full of light. So I'm not so sure about exactly what's dematerialized here. That's a possibly connected, obviously, but possibly separable theme.
Yeah, I would say that by dematerialize, I mean that the experience of the viewer becomes as important as the work itself. So it is not a self-contained entity, the artwork itself, something that can exist also independently by the viewer. Now, of course, we could say that no artwork exists without
we could,
without the viewer. But if we want to remain in this moment of abstractions, we could say that this idea of the presence of the viewer has been stressed particularly by generations of artists from the 60s, the 70s, and I think it is important also for us not only to understand these works from our own perspective today, but also understanding what these artists they were onto, what they were looking for. So that's my idea behind the use of the term dematerialization. And of course, I completely agree with you. It's true, light enters the room. We are talking of but we're still talking of a light sculpture. So the object, the artwork, does not disappear ever in the case of Flavin. In particular, also the fluorescent tube is always there, and I think it is very important that.
You're right. You're right. Of course, but I'm tempted, as I guess I often am, to be a bit stubborn about it, because you think of well, our pride and joy here in Chicago, the Seurat painting, the Grand Shot, has its own original frame, and the frame, Seurat was interested in the way that the frame created light effects in the painting, and around the edges of the canvas, just within the frame, he actually painted some quote-unquote reflections of colored light from the frame. So that's working with light in a way that I would find very hard to differentiate from Flavin, from what Flavin is doing. When I'm in my stubborn mode, right? I mean, it's not hard to distinguish the two artworks, but when you're talking about self-consciousness, attempts to absorb, and also the failure of those attempts, and dematerialization in the sense that you're talking about it, I think you have a continuous tradition. And when I say that, I'm also aware of the fact that if Flavin were here, he'd be stomping his feet, because that's not the intention of these various foreclosures that he liked to indulge in.
Yes, so if we have if we decide that dematerialization is certainly not the term to apply to this, the case of this of Flavin's work, I wanted to ask you something on the use of the corner, which is very peculiar, both in the case of work. So the opposite of the dematerialization, something instead that has to do with architecture, with an element, with the concrete element, because the corner is an architectural element of the real space of the room, and this is something that is using both in the case of the Untitled to Helen Winkler. Of course, there is also reference to Malevich here, but also in the case of the artwork that we are commenting, that we are discussing more closely, which is Untitled to Barbara Wool. I wanted to ask you more about what do you make of this use of the corner?
That's an interesting subject, because since we started out talking about religion and art, if you were to start from that frame, I think one of the things that you would say first is that the corner is like a poor man's niche or a poor man's chapel or something like that. It's missing a wall, but it's got two walls. It's a space where you can turn away from the rest of the room, whatever that room is, maybe a large exhibition space with a lot of other works in it. You're being asked to turn away from it to face the corner. So there is, I think, room there for expanding on those religious resonances that he had. But then there's also this other aspect, and that is his use of commercial materials, and all the rest of that fits perfectly with the awareness also that he would have known from the 60s of urban spaces and artists who use those, even artists as different from him as Joseph Beuys, who did a cast in tallow of some pedestrian underpass at one point, made this disused space full of stairways and corners into a cast. It's just the first example that came to my mind of a number of artists doing things like that draw attention to overlooked spaces, and that part of it fits with the construction and the commercial materials.
Something that I find very fascinating in Flavin, it has to do also with the use of the corner and in general his preference for a material like the fluorescent tube is that in the case of his work doesn't have the materiality that we might expect from a sculpture, but at the same time is a three-dimensional object. There is no plinth, but it has also a monumentality that we might associate with sculpture. So there is this first paradox. Also, it doesn't have the window on the wall aspect that painting traditionally offered, but also at the same time is standing nearby a wall. Even though it isn't framed, the work. The general effect of the work is atmospheric and depends upon the viewer's presence, according to a certain reading of Flavin's work. And yet, when he employs one color, it looks that he's doing also monochromatic paintings, or when he's using more colors, they look like a color-filled paintings. So I was something that very much fascinates me with Flavin is that he seems to have a taste for the paradox. And I was wondering if you also find something like that in his work.
Taste for paradox, you mean, or eclecticism? I mean,
I mean more the paradox, because it seems that the work is asking you, who am I? I don't know my own identity. And this is something that very much fascinating. I find extremely fascinating in his work.
That's an interesting thought. I've never thought of it that way. If you were to pursue that, I wonder what, as a thought experiment, if he had been thinking that, what would have been other steps that he would have taken in order to create that kind of doubt? Because he settled on a certain limited number of display strategies. So if he were attempting that, he might have found others. By the way, I don't know if I'm, as the guest, I don't know if I'm allowed to point this out, but there's a question which connects with what you were just saying from Nelson that I'm seeing in the chat. Do you mind if I read it? It's kind of interesting. It fits along with what you were saying. One of Dia's co-founders, who subsequently became a Sufi teacher and lineage holder, has a meditation space in Lower Manhattan that was photographed with a Dan Flavin neon piece on the back wall, though it's no longer installed there. But that fact fascinates. And for instance, members of Slavs and Tatars, I believe, have referred to the space as a mosque. Does such a context and consequent readings add meanings in Flavin's work or misguided, quote unquote? So another thing that these are like, very peripherally, but not something you would want to rule out of court, is a mihrab, a prayer niche in Islam. These are a place, a practice in which you do face corners, you do face into the niche-like spaces. So I think if these kind of things, they're only misguided if you would want to propose them as primary meanings. They're certainly not misguided if they were demonstrably in the cultural mix at the time. All the meanings you've just named certainly are. But then all of this kind of interpretation, though, which risks greater and greater distance from statements the artist may have made, all of this kind of interpretation also risks becoming ahistorical in the name of the greater complexity of the artist in question. And that itself is something that goes against the grain of Flavin's way of talking about his work. That is to say, like I was saying, closing doors, foreclosing interpretations. Because if you want to present the work as holding in suspension a large number of meanings for the purpose of paradox or for the purpose of complexity and other modernists and postmodernists' virtues, then it is possible that you reach a point where you become counterintuitive, unattached to the historical record, because in the name of this kind of complexity. This is something that academics are unfortunately very prone to do, because the more levels of meaning and the more that it can be shown that there are deliberate suspensions of ambiguous meanings and multiple meanings, the better. And so it's something that in this case, I think you could just refer to the artist's statements as a way of questioning.
Yeah, I would say, Professor Elkins, that I don't want to give the impression that I do not think that art does not have a history. Of course, art has a history, and we need to know that. But at the same time, I always I'm fascinated by the idea of trying to find more meanings that in some way might enrich also our own comprehension of these works. But as long as you also always make clear that when is your own interpretation starting.
Yeah.
Probably Umberto Eco, he made a very clear distinction between use and interpretation of a text in the limits of interpretation.
Well, how few meanings would you be willing to countenance in the case of Flavin? Would you be willing to whittle down your list of meanings just to one or two, or even to his negations?
But there are no, I don't think that there are correct ways of looking at Flavin's art, but there are possibilities to, how can I say, to have more or less sophisticated interpretations, as long as one makes clear which one is the starting point of your own interpretation. From where are you starting from?
Yeah, that's fair.
So the I was going to ask you if we can return on that. How can I say, escape from the specificity of the medium in the case of Flavin. And I remember that while we were discussing about this conversation briefly before to have it, you mentioned that you were considering about the possibility of combining the discourse of the lack of specificity or abandoning medium specificity and the religious discourse, so to say, the possible analysis on the relation between Flavin and Flavin's work and religion and spirituality. How would you combine these two thread of thoughts?
Yeah, I have to. I hope it won't be disappointing if I answer in a very oblique way, because so I've been following this subject of religion and art since that book, and I still get invitations from Christian institutions to speak. I find these things really interesting. I've been to Biola University in Los Angeles a couple times, Bible Institute of Los Angeles, places that people from large secular universities hardly ever go. So I find this subject really interesting, but my engagement with it has shifted in the last number of years, because I find that in order to make headway on these issues, it really is necessary to think seriously about what kinds of conversations can happen and when they can happen, how they can happen, so on. And so here's now I'm going to risk being very oblique, but this is the way that I think about these things now. I'll give you an example. Think that when people in my field meet at a conference, like art historians, art theorists, something like that, usually we will identify ourselves to each other by talking about our specialty first. So I'm a specialist in late Michelangelo and that kind of thing. And then if we get to know each other, then we might end up talking more broadly about all sorts of things. In my experience at some of these Christian institutions, when there are conferences on religion and art, and many of them, by the way, these invitations are sent to me by people who are really concerned that they're not part of the art world, and there's a practical concern, but there's also a concern that their faith is not represented. Mm-hmm. So in those situations, a different kind of conversation often happens, and that is, I'm asked first what my faith is. Mm. And I answer honestly. I was too surprised to answer cogently the first couple of times I was asked, but now I have an honest answer. I'm a lapsed Jewish boy. I'm a very, I have all sorts of mea culpas about that, but it's honest. And what I hope it communicates is that I understand what faith and belief are, and I take them very seriously. That's a very broad thing to ask somebody at first, and then in these conversations, then once that happens, then the conversation can narrow down. So I think of these as diametrically opposed forms of conversation, from the narrow to the wide, from the wide to the narrow. And this kind of thing is the best hope, I think, for bringing forward these conversations about religion and art. So just to swoop back into the question of Flavin and this in this particular case, you would have to find a way to to have a conversation between people like the ones that we somewhat unfairly exemplified by Rosalind Krauss and Tim Clark. You would have to find a way to open a conversation between people for whom it would be a fundamental misunderstanding to pursue any of these religious analogies between them and people for whom questions of faith come first, questions of art come second, maybe a close second, but they come second. And to do that, I think it's necessary to step back in this way and think about the forms of conversation. So I hope that wasn't too annoying, but it seems to me that these conversations stalls in such predictable ways when you say things like, well, but Flavin, believed this, or Warhol, was very pious. And so can't you see that the Last Supper doesn't matter if there are 14 apostles, 24 apostles, it's still pious, that sort of thing. Those kind of conversations just will never work.
So, because we returned also on the conversation on art and religion, we have a question from Nancy, and she asks, can you talk a bit about modern and contemporary art with respect to other religious traditions? The art historical discourse of the 20th century largely avoids not only Judeo-Christian religious topics, but also those from other religions. Are these similarly topics that should not be discussed in the broader scope of art history? Is it still this way today?
Yeah, and I'm glad that we had a chance to get to this question, because most examples of this issue that we've been talking about in the art world really are about Catholicism. And that's because in the European tradition, of course, Catholicism is the image-rich tradition. Protestantism is relatively image-poor, and so on. And the Jewish tradition is always present, but also not a major stream in most of these conversations. But as soon as you make it more international, as it is in places where I work, you have people representing all sorts of religions. I had a woman in a class last year who speaks Amharic. I didn't even know that's the third largest Semitic language in the world until she told me. So I'm continuously being educated in these things. I find that what happens is if you as an artist identify yourself, or if you're known as a practitioner of a major world faith, and you somehow make that known in your work as a title, as an artist statement or something like that, you basically ensure a level of respect and silence at the same time. You're not going to start conversations. You're not going to get. You're not going to have people exploring those meanings, because it's going to be the way it's going to be understood, as it is in the case of that East Asian student I mentioned at the beginning. It's going to be taken as something personal, even though to you it may not be. It may be the way you were brought up, and everyone around you that you ever knew before you came to this art school in the United States, that kind of thing. So the distinction, though, to be made, two distinctions. One is between all faiths that represent major world religions whose name at least is recognized, like Jainism, something that someone will at least know that they've heard it. Distinction between that and art that represents those faiths, but critically, then all of a sudden, if there's a critical edge to it, then the conversation can open in many different directions. And the second distinction is between all of these major world faiths and anything that is presented as either extremely regional or local, or personal. So if you have, for example, I saw an artwork a little while ago, which was by a Native American, but it was with modified symbols, so we were told. So that became semi-private. And in that case, again, the entire of the art world discourse will shut down in the name of respect and letting the person have that. You could say that Flavin is like this, right? Because you have a really idiosyncratic practice. And no matter if he were still around and he were saying, and he said, I really don't mind, let's talk about this as a Greek cross, it would still be the same sort of result these days. People would do it. Obviously people would interview him and so on, but it would also be considered that part of the message is that this is not the way a normal Irish Catholic guy behaves. He doesn't go out and buy neon tubes and put them in the corners of galleries. And so therefore there's something unique or idiosyncratic and or private about the practice. So it would meet that same kind of, in the end, laying down of inquiry, laying down of discourse.
Thank you, Professor Elkins. I think that unfortunately we have time for just one more question, and so this will be my final question. And I wanted to ask you that it is possible that at different historical times might have radically different experiences of the same object. At a personal level too, that's something that happens to me often. It might happen that we see a work, a movie, when we are, at, I don't know, 20 years old, and then we see the same work after 10 years and we have a completely different experience of it. I want to ask you, what did it mean, in your opinion, to see this work in the 1970s, and what does it mean to see this work today?
Well, it's not hypothetical. I'm old enough to tell you. It was, yeah, see, you thought that was a hypothetical question, but no, that moment of minimalism was exhilarating because it was absolutely radical, as it meant to be. Right? And obviously not just Flavin, any number of others at around about in the same decade, in the 70s, when this became widely exhibited. But the reason that it was exhilarating was because of what had immediately preceded it, especially those big gestures of abstract expressionism in North America. So that moment is decisively past, I hope, for everybody, because that's the topical, local, constrained nature of the meaning of these works. And so what we have now is this really interesting possibility of having these strangely open-ended conversations like the one that we've just had, in which we can talk about really big issues like faith and religion while we're looking at fluorescent tubes, at that neon tube. So that's interesting. That's a very interesting moment, completely different from the one in the 70s. Maybe much more promising.
And you are never worried that by this broadening of our conversations, at times we might lose the scope or the meaning of what is art? You never.
No, I'm not worried you'd lose the meaning of what's art. I thought you were going to say you would lose the specificity of the fact that you're talking about a particular artist and their particular works.
Yes.
That's not necessarily the case. We're talking about changing modes of interpretation.
Okay, I would love to continue this conversation, but unfortunately our time is up, Professor Elkins. But I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in this evening, and especially to Professor Elkins for joining us.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Professor Elkins. The Menil's next In Dialogue program on the work of J. DeFeo will take place on Wednesday, August 19th with Leah Levy, the Executive Director of the J. DeFeo Foundation, and Natalie Dupechet, the Menil's Assistant Curator of Modern Art. You can learn more about these and other programs by visiting menil.org. As always, the Menil's programs are free and open to everyone. Thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you soon.